At my father's wedding, my name was printed at the very last table, shoved between two distant cousins I could barely recognize. My stepmother Elaine didn't even wait for me to ask why. She stepped up beside me, her perfume sharp and sweet, and smiled like she was letting me in on a private joke. "We had to prioritize," she said. At the head table, my father sat between Elaine and her son Derek, the golden boy who could do no wrong, laughing like the rest of the room didn't exist. In that moment, I knew exactly where I stood, and I knew I was done pretending to belong. I had been on the outside for years, but this was different. This was a public display, a message for everyone to see. I smoothed the skirt of my navy dress, the one I wore to meetings with high-end clients, and kept my voice calm. "Thanks for making it so easy," I said. I turned and walked away, the sound of my heels echoing against the marble floor like a countdown to something they would never see coming. I didn't rush. I wanted them to notice. I passed the bar, the white draped tables, the massive floral arrangements, and headed straight for the door. The valet looked surprised when I handed him my ticket, but he didn't ask questions. I slid into my car, shut the door, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to clarity. Elaine thought she had won. My father thought this was just another small insult I would swallow. But they had just handed me the perfect reason to stop playing by their rules. For as long as I could remember, I had tried to keep the peace. Holidays, birthdays, family dinners, where Derek's achievements were paraded around like trophies, while my work as an interior designer was dismissed as a hobby. I had told myself to ignore it, to focus on my career, to accept that I would never be their priority. But as I drove away from that hotel, I realized I wasn't interested in acceptance anymore. I was interested in consequences. Not the kind that happened by chance, but the kind you plan step by step until the people who underestimated you have no idea how they ended up at the bottom. I didn't cry. I didn't second guess my choice. I just drove every mile, taking me farther from the woman who sat me at the back and the man who let her. Somewhere between the parking garage and my apartment, I decided this wasn't going to be one more memory I buried. This was going to be the start of something else entirely. They had made their priorities clear. Now, I was going to make mine. And mine involved making sure that one day they would look around at the pieces of their perfect little world and realize I was the one who had tipped it all over. I grew up believing that if I worked hard enough, my father would eventually see me. Not just look at me, but really see me. Richard Cole was a man who respected results, or so I thought. But the results he respected were always the ones that fit his version of success. When I was 10, I designed my first room makeover. My mother had just passed away, and I wanted to do something to make my small bedroom feel brighter, safer. I rearranged furniture, painted the walls, even sewed my own curtains from fabric we had in storage. My father barely glanced inside. "Nice," he said. "But you should spend more time on math." He was already planting the seeds of the future he wanted for me, something corporate, something with numbers and power, something like his construction business. That dream died the moment I told him I was studying interior design. He didn't yell, he didn't forbid it. He just smiled in that way people do when they've decided you'll be a disappointment. He never came to a single one of my exhibitions. Never asked about my clients. If he brought me up to his friends at all, it was with a polite, "She's doing her thing," followed by a quick subject change to Derek's latest venture. Derek was the perfect son in my father's eyes. Even before Elaine married him into the family, Richard was investing in Derek's projects. Tech startups, real estate, flips, anything. Derek touched, my father backed. I watched as Derek failed and tried again each time with a new cash injection. When I needed help to expand my own small design studio, my father offered advice instead of support. "You should be saving for a real career," he said, "one you can retire from." I learned to stop asking. I worked long hours, took whatever contracts I could, and built my client list from scratch. I paid for my own apartment, my own car, every piece of furniture I owned. But every holiday gathering was the same. Derek's successes filled the room. My work was reduced to a line or two, if mentioned at all. The worst part wasn't just the imbalance. It was the way my father looked at me, like he was tolerating me, like my choices were a phase I'd grow out of. I told myself it didn't matter, that my career was mine, and his approval wasn't necessary. But approval has a way of feeling necessary when it comes from a parent. And the truth was, some part of me still wanted it. That's why the wedding seating chart stung so much. It wasn't just that I was placed at the last table. It was that he saw nothing wrong with it. In his mind, it made perfect sense that Derek would sit beside him while I sat near the service entrance. It was a physical manifestation of the hierarchy I had been living under for years. And it wasn't going to stop there. I had overheard enough to know that Elaine was pushing him to update his will, that she wanted the company, the properties, and the investments to be secured in her name and Derek's. I was a loose end she intended to cut. If I walked away quietly, I'd lose more than a seat at a wedding. I'd lose my place in the family entirely. Not that there was much of one left, but also any claim to the legacy my mother had helped build before she died. That was the real stake. This wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about survival. They thought I would sulk, maybe avoid family dinners for a while, but eventually come crawling back. What they didn't realize was that I was already mapping out the kind of payback that doesn't come with warning shots. If they were going to treat me like an outsider, then I would act like one with nothing to lose, and enough information to turn their perfect little empire inside out. Elaine didn't waste time establishing control when she married my father. She slipped into his life like she'd always belonged there, hosting dinner parties for his business contacts, reorganizing his calendar, and managing the household staff like a CEO. At first, I told myself she was just efficient. My father had never been good with the details, so maybe this was a good thing. But it didn't take long to see the pattern. Everything she touched was restructured in a way that centered her and Derek and pushed me further to the edges. It started small. I'd show up for a family dinner, and she'd inform me that plans had changed at the last minute. Or she'd invite me to events without telling me the actual start time, ensuring I arrived late and out of place. I didn't think much of it until I overheard her telling someone at one of those dinners Samantha is sweet, but she's very busy with her little projects. Little projects. That was how she described the design contracts that kept a roof over my head and my studio afloat. Derek, meanwhile, was introduced with glowing monologues about his vision, his leadership, his potential. Even when Derek made obvious mistakes over leveraging his first tech startup, losing investors' money, Elaine framed it as a learning experience, an inevitable step on the road to greatness. My father absorbed every word. If Derek's failures were stepping stones, mine were evidence of bad judgment. When I finally landed a high-profile contract redesigning the lobby of a boutique hotel downtown, Elaine managed to turn it into a slight. "That's cute," she said. "But will the exposure pay your rent?" Derek never heard comments like that. If he signed a deal, it was a triumph. If I did, it was a gamble. The gap widened with every passing year. Derek got a new condo as a reward for his hard work. I got a lecture on saving money. Derek received introductions to my father's wealthiest clients. I got reminders to keep my rates competitive. By the time the wedding was announced, the division in the family was complete. Elaine controlled my father's schedule, filtered his calls, and managed his paperwork. Derek had power of attorney for certain business decisions. I had whatever scraps of time and attention were left over. And I knew better than to think any of it was accidental. Elaine had a way of wrapping her manipulations in courtesy, so it never looked like sabotage. She'd smile while excluding me from a conversation laugh, while dismissing my work and make every insult sound like concern. "You know I only want the best for you," she'd say right after undermining me in front of my father. I started to notice things others didn't. Property titles that had quietly shifted names. Investments made through shell companies Derek controlled. Withdrawals from accounts my mother's inheritance had once funded. Whenever I tried to bring it up to my father, he brushed it off. "Don't be paranoid, Sam. Elaine's just protecting the family." Protecting in this case meant consolidating power until there was no room for me at all. By the time the wedding came around, I understood my role in their version of family ornamental, at best disposable at worst. The seating chart wasn't an oversight. It was the final touch in a long campaign to make sure I knew exactly where I stood. And standing there that afternoon, staring at my name beside strangers, I realized I'd had enough. I didn't care how careful Elaine had been. Everyone leaves a trail. And I was done pretending I hadn't seen hers. Once you start looking for cracks, you see them everywhere. After the wedding, I stopped trying to stay on the surface of things and began digging. My first step was casual enough. I called a friend from college, Melissa, who now worked as a paralegal for a real estate law firm. I told her I was curious about some of my father's recent property acquisitions. Within a week, she had emailed me a list of transactions tied to his name. Half of them I recognized projects he'd mentioned over dinner years ago, but the other half were surprises, and most of those were no longer in his name. They had been transferred to holding companies managed by Derek, or more interestingly, by one of Elaine's old colleagues from her PR days. The transfers weren't illegal on the surface, but the prices caught my attention. Properties worth millions sold for a fraction of market value sometimes to entities that dissolved within months. I knew enough about business to recognize when assets were being hidden. That was the first crack. The second came from an overheard conversation at a cafe near my studio. I'd stopped in for a quick coffee before meeting a client and spotted one of my father's senior project managers sitting with a man I didn't recognize. I wasn't close enough to hear every word, but I caught Derek's name, the phrase bridge loan, and something about offshore accounts. When the meeting ended, I waited until the manager left, and then slipped a business card to the other man with a note on the back. Call me. That night he did. His name was Victor, and he was an independent contractor Derek had hired for a failed tech expansion 2 years earlier. According to Victor, Derek had funneled a significant portion of his father's company profits into risky overseas investments. When the deals collapsed, Derek covered the losses by liquidating company assets that technically my father still believed he owned. I didn't need much more to confirm my suspicions, but I wasn't about to move without proof. So I started building a file. Every transaction, every public record, every press release Elaine had put out about Derek's ventures, it all went into a folder. Melissa pulled title histories, Victor shared old contracts, and I even paid a freelance investigator to trace the shell companies. What emerged was a clear pattern. Elaine and Derek were moving money and property into their own control, under the guise of protecting the family business. My father either didn't know or didn't care. Maybe he trusted them. Maybe he didn't want the hassle of managing it all himself. Either way, the effect was the same. They were bleeding the empire he'd built. And if nothing stopped them, there would be nothing left, except what they chose to keep. I also learned that Elaine was pushing my father to sign an updated will. The new version, still in draft form, listed Derek as primary heir to the company, with Elaine controlling all liquid assets. My name wasn't even mentioned. The draft wasn't public, but a friend of Melissa's in the clerk's office had seen it in the queue for notarization. That was when the investigation stopped being hypothetical. This wasn't just a power grab, it was a clean erasure. They weren't content with sidelining me socially, they were cutting me out completely, both personally and financially. I realized then that if I waited for my father to wake up and see what they were doing, I'd be waiting forever. He had made his choice. I needed to make mine. The question was how to move without tipping them off. Elaine was too careful to be caught in a direct confrontation. Derek was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. They both operated under the assumption that I was harmless, a woman with a small design studio, no corporate influence, and no appetite for conflict. They didn't see me as a threat, and that was going to be their mistake. I didn't need to beat them at their own game. I just needed to make their game public. The breaking point came less than 3 weeks after the wedding. I'd been keeping my distance, letting them believe I was sulking, when I got a call from one of my father's longtime employees. He sounded uneasy. Elaine had shown up at the office with a stack of papers for my father to sign. She claimed they were routine updates to company insurance policies. The employee had glanced at the top sheet and seen the words "Last Will and Testament." My father was in his private office with her at that moment, pen in hand. I knew exactly what was happening. She wasn't going to wait for the will to quietly pass through legal channels. She was getting it signed right there under the pretense of business paperwork before anyone could intervene. I told the employee to stall them as long as possible. Then I called Melissa. She confirmed my suspicion the draft will was still unfiled, which meant Elaine was pushing to finalize it before anyone noticed. If he signed that day, everything I had been gathering evidence for would mean nothing. I drove to the office, but I didn't go upstairs. Confronting them in that moment would only give them the chance to pivot, to recast me as the unstable daughter making baseless accusations. Instead, I waited in the parking lot, watching through the plate glass as they moved from one document to the next. When they finally left, I stayed where I was until their car pulled away. Then I went inside straight to the employee who had called me. He had managed to copy the signature pages on the office scanner. I slipped the copies into my bag and walked out without another word. The signatures alone wouldn't undo the damage, but they would prove coercion if I could tie them to the right timeline and circumstances. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to plead with my father to see reason. He had made his choice to trust Elaine and Derek, and that trust was going to cost him. I would make sure it cost them more. Until that point, my plan had been to quietly build a case, hand it to the right people, and let it run its course. But watching them sit in his office and slide those pages across the desk like it was nothing like erasing me from my own family was just another transaction change something in me. This wasn't going to be quiet anymore. It was going to be a controlled demolition. I would strip away their credibility, their resources, and their carefully constructed public image. By the time I was finished, they wouldn't just lose what they had stolen, they would be radioactive to anyone who might have helped them recover. The signed pages were my leverage. The property transfers were my ammunition. And the best part was they still thought I was licking my wounds over a seating chart. They had no idea that while they were celebrating their win, I was already preparing to turn the entire board upside down. The first strike had to be public. Private confrontations could be denied, twisted, or buried. Public scrutiny, once ignited, had a way of burning on its own. I started with the one thing Elaine and Derek valued almost as much as money: reputation. Derek's tech company had been skating on thin ice for months. I knew from Victor and from public filings that he was behind on deliverables for a major government contract. The delays were bad enough, but the reason for them was worse funds meant for research and development had been redirected to cover his real estate shortfalls. That was the kind of information journalists loved, especially if it could be corroborated. I packaged everything: I had financial records, property transfers, shell company connections into a neat chronological file. Melissa helped me scrub anything that could trace back to me directly. Then I sent it anonymously to a business reporter at the Houston Herald, someone with a reputation for exposing corporate misconduct. 3 weeks later, the story hit the front page. The headline wasn't subtle: local tech CEO misuses funds ties to questionable real estate deals. The article detailed Derek's financial juggling act, highlighting the same transactions I had been staring at for months. Elaine's name was woven through the piece, mentioned as a consultant who had brokered several of the deals. She wasn't accused of anything outright, but the implication was there for anyone who could read between the lines. The fallout was immediate. Derek's investors started calling emergency meetings. One of his biggest contracts was suspended pending review. Social media lit up with speculation, and by the end of the day, his office had gone into lockdown mode, issuing a bland statement about misunderstandings and temporary cash flow issues. My father called me that night for the first time in months. He didn't apologize. He didn't even ask how I was. He wanted to know if I'd heard about Derek's bad press and whether I thought it would blow over. I told him it probably wouldn't. Then I let the silence stretch until he ended the call. I wasn't going to give him comfort. 2 days later, another story broke, this time in a real estate industry newsletter. It covered the suspicious property transfers, complete with sale prices and corporate links. The writer cited publicly available records as the source, which was technically true. What they didn't say was that those records had been sitting in my file for months, waiting for the right moment. By the end of the week, Elaine was fielding calls from people she used to schmooze at charity galas. Invitations to events she'd been certain she would headline suddenly evaporated. One of her pet projects, a luxury condo development she had been promoting with Derek, lost its primary investor. I didn't stop there. I leaked the signed will pages to a small but aggressive legal blog that specialized in estate disputes. They ran a piece questioning whether Richard Cole was being influenced into changing his will under duress. Again, no accusations, just pointed questions paired with very real signatures and dates. It was enough to plant seeds. Suddenly, there were whispers about Elaine's role in the family business, about whether Derek's rise had been built on solid ground or on favors and manipulation. The beauty of the first strike was that it didn't require me to push beyond the initial release. The information did the work for me. Every phone call they had to return, every statement they had to craft, every rumor they had to chase. It all drained their time, focus, and resources. And the best part, they still didn't know it was me. I could see it in the way my father spoke when he called again, this time sounding more agitated. He was blaming enemies of the family, certain that some disgruntled business rival had launched an attack. He never once considered that the daughter he'd seated next to strangers at his wedding might be the one lighting the match. That was fine with me. The less they suspected, the harder it would hit when the next strike landed. The public cracks were showing now, visible enough that even people outside our circle could see them. All I had to do was keep widening them until the whole facade collapsed. The second strike had to cut deeper, something that would not just tarnish their image, but actively dismantle their ability to operate. Public opinion was a good starting point, but legal pressure would make it impossible for them to recover quickly. Melissa and I mapped out the angles. The signed will pages were valuable, but they weren't enough on their own. We needed to connect those signatures to a larger pattern of coercion and financial misconduct. That meant bringing in someone with teeth, a lawyer who specialized in contested estates and white-collar crime. We found him in Austin, a man named Peter Rains, who had built his career exposing family business fraud. I didn't tell Peter everything about my personal connection at first. I framed it as a concerned party scenario, presenting the transaction's property transfers and will signatures as evidence that a wealthy businessman was being manipulated by his wife and stepson. Peter took one look at the documents and said there was enough here to justify both a civil suit and a request for court-appointed oversight of my father's financial affairs. That was the lever we needed. Once a judge got involved, every transaction Derek and Elaine had touched in the last 2 years would be under a microscope. We filed the petition quietly, using a procedural path that didn't immediately alert them. The court set a preliminary review hearing for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, Peter's office sent formal requests for financial disclosure to my father's company. Those requests landed like bombs. I know because within 48 hours, Elaine called me for the first time in over a year. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Do you know anything about this court order?" she asked. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about, and hung up before she could push further. A day later, Derek's company released a statement blaming malicious actors for trying to destabilize their business. That might have played well to his loyalists, but the market didn't buy it. His share prices dropped another 12% in a week. The legal filings were public record now, and smaller media outlets began piecing the story together. It wasn't just about one bad tech investment anymore. It was about whether the entire Cole family business was being stripped for parts by its own heirs. That narrative had a way of sticking. Peter pushed the advantage. He coordinated with an investigative accountant who began combing through every account connected to my father, Elaine, and Derek. The accountant found irregularities in expense reports, including lavish consulting fees paid to a company in Derek's name for work that didn't exist. Those findings were submitted to the court as part of the oversight petition. Elaine's tone shifted after that. She stopped calling and started sending emails, polite, overly formal messages, asking me to come to the table for the good of the family. I ignored every one. My father, on the other hand, broke his silence with a voicemail that was almost pathetic. "I think we need to talk. Things are getting complicated." I didn't call him back. By the second week, Derek was missing from his usual social circuit. Photos of him at charity events and business launches dried up. Rumors circulated that several of his accounts had been frozen pending investigation. The legal pressure was working. They were spending more time in meetings with their attorneys than on their businesses. And the best part was still to come. Peter advised me to time the next move carefully. We wanted them off-balance, bleeding resources before we hit them with the most damaging revelation of all. In the final days before the hearing, I had Melissa leak one last piece to the press, details of the offshore accounts Victor had told me about. The story broke on a Thursday morning, complete with bank document excerpts showing transfers to a Caribbean bank from both Derek's company and one of Elaine's holding entities. That kind of news doesn't just damage reputations, it triggers government interest. By Friday afternoon, the state attorney's office had announced a preliminary inquiry into possible tax evasion and money laundering. Derek and Elaine went from controlling the narrative to desperately trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. And me, I was just getting started. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It came in waves, each one stronger than the last, until there was nothing left for them to cling to. The first wave hit the morning of the preliminary hearing. Peter and I sat in the back of the courtroom far enough from Elaine and Derek that they didn't notice me right away. My father was there too, looking older than I remembered, his suit hanging a little loose at the shoulders. Elaine sat stiff beside him, whispering into his ear with that same brittle smile she wore at the wedding. Derek was behind them, scrolling through his phone like none of this mattered. When the judge called the case, Peter laid out our petition, the evidence of coercion in the will, signing the suspicious property transfers, the irregular consulting fees, and the offshore accounts. He kept it clinical factual, letting the paper trail speak for itself. The judge listened, flipping through the binders Peter had submitted. Elaine's attorney objected at every turn, but each objection seemed to irritate the judge more. When it was their turn, Elaine's side offered vague explanations about strategic asset management and family restructuring. They had nothing to counter the actual documents. By the end of the hearing, the judge granted temporary oversight of my father's business holdings to a court-appointed trustee. That meant every major financial decision was out of Elaine and Derek's hands. The look on Elaine's face when she heard the ruling was worth every late night I'd spent compiling evidence. The second wave came a week later when the Houston Herald ran another front-page story. This one had photos, high-resolution shots of Derek at a resort in the Cayman Islands with a known tax shelter consultant. The article detailed the offshore accounts, citing sources close to the investigation for confirmation that federal authorities were now involved. That phrase alone was enough to send Derek's remaining investors scrambling for the exits. Contracts were canceled, lines of credit called in. Within days, his company's offices were a ghost town. The third wave was personal. The trustee appointed by the court froze all discretionary spending from my father's accounts pending review. Elaine's credit cards were shut off. The household staff was cut back to essentials. She couldn't host her charity luncheons, couldn't buy her designer dresses, couldn't maintain the image she'd spent years crafting. I knew it was eating her alive. Derek fared no better. The condo development he'd been promoting collapsed when the bank pulled its financing. Lawsuits from contractors started piling up. Without liquid assets, he was forced to put his penthouse on the market. I heard through Melissa that he'd been spotted at meetings with a bankruptcy attorney. The fourth wave was almost poetic. The same society pages that once fawned over Elaine's style and influence now printed gossip about her fall from grace. Photos of her arriving at the courthouse replaced the glossy gala shots. She looked smaller somehow, her posture less certain, her hair no longer perfectly styled. My father called once during all of this. He didn't mention the wedding or Derek or Elaine. He just said, "This has gotten out of hand, you need to back off." I let him talk, let him try to play the patriarch, and then I said the one thing I'd been holding back since that day at the seating chart. "You made your priorities clear, Dad. Now I'm making mine." I hung up before he could respond. The fifth and final wave came when the state attorney's office announced formal charges against Derek for tax evasion and wire fraud. Elaine wasn't charged, but she was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the indictment. That label alone was enough to end whatever scraps of her social standing remained. By the end of the year, Derek was out on bail awaiting trial. Elaine was living in a rented townhouse on the outskirts of the city. My father had moved into a smaller property under the supervision of the court-appointed trustee. The empire they had tried to cut me out of was now in ruins, not because I wanted it, but because they had built it on greed and arrogance, and I had simply pulled away the curtain for everyone to see. Standing on the balcony of my new studio one evening, watching the city lights stretch out toward the horizon, I felt no urge to gloat. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake anymore. It was about balance. They had written me out of the picture, and now the picture was gone. And the best part was that I hadn't needed to shout or plead or make them see my worth. I had simply let their own actions destroy them with a little help from the truth. When the dust settled, I realized how much space their absence had created in my life. For years, every decision I made had been filtered through the lens of my father's opinion, the shadow of Derek's success, and Elaine's constant judgment. Without that noise, my world felt quieter, cleaner. I could walk into my studio in the morning and focus entirely on my clients, without wondering if a snide comment from a family dinner would be replaying in my head later. The new contracts I'd landed during the chaos had turned into steady work. Word of mouth spread faster than I expected, especially after I completed a luxury apartment redesign that got featured in a regional design magazine. For the first time, my schedule was full months in advance, not because I was scrambling for jobs, but because people sought me out. My apartment felt different too. I started adding small touches. I'd been putting off art I loved, instead of what I thought would be impressive furniture chosen for comfort rather than price tags that proved something to anyone else. I even took a week off my first real vacation in years to visit a coastal town I'd always wanted to see. I didn't check my email once. Melissa joined me for part of the trip, and one night over dinner, she asked if I felt like I'd won. I thought about it for a long moment. Winning wasn't the right word. It implied a game we'd all agreed to play, and I'd stopped agreeing to their rules a long time ago. What I felt was something closer to release. I no longer needed to explain myself to people who had no interest in understanding me. The absence of that constant need for validation was worth more than any inheritance could have been. My father was still alive, still under the trustee's oversight, but I hadn't spoken to him in months. He didn't reach out again after our last conversation. I knew from whispers in the business community that his health was declining and that Elaine had all but disappeared from public life. Derek's trial was scheduled for the spring, and his name had become shorthand in local circles for hubris and downfall. None of it tempted me to re-engage. I didn't want updates or closure. I had already closed that door myself. What surprised me most was how quickly my day-to-day stress faded once I stopped looking over my shoulder. I could spend a Sunday morning baking for no reason, take on a passion project for a friend without worrying about how it looked on paper, or walk through a hardware store just to get ideas for a new design. Life wasn't perfect, bills still came, deadlines still loomed, but it was mine, entirely mine, and that was enough. I started to understand that healing isn't always about fixing what was broken. Sometimes it's about letting go of the pieces altogether and building something new in the space they leave behind. The call came on a Tuesday morning just as I was sketching ideas for a new client project. It was from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. A voice I barely recognized, my cousin's, told me my father had passed away the night before. The words hung there oddly weightless. I didn't feel the rush of grief I'd braced for, nor the surge of relief I thought might come. There was nothing, just a quiet acknowledgement that a chapter had closed without my input. My cousin didn't linger on the line. He simply said he thought I should know, then hung up. I set the phone down and went back to my sketches. That might sound cold, but it was honest. I had mourned the relationship years earlier at that wedding when he made his priorities clear. This was just the final formality. In the days that followed, I heard through others that the funeral was a small, awkward affair. Elaine attended looking tired and older, her once perfect presentation frayed at the edges. Derek was nowhere to be seen, still entangled in legal battles that were draining whatever was left of his resources. They had each gotten exactly what they had worked for. My father had chosen a family dynamic built on favoritism and exclusion. Elaine had chosen greed over stability. Derek had chosen shortcuts over integrity. All of them were now living or dying with the consequences. I didn't need to be there to see it. Some people talk about revenge as if it's an act you commit, a singular moment where you strike back. But I've learned that sometimes the most effective revenge is simply refusing to carry their burdens anymore. I didn't shout, didn't sabotage, didn't storm into a boardroom to make a scene. I just removed myself and let their own patterns pull them under, giving the truth a little nudge into the light when the timing was right. Walking away wasn't weakness, it was a strategy. It stopped the cycle before it could pull me in any deeper, and it left me with something they could never take, a life that was fully mine. I thought about that as I finished the client sketches that day. The lines came easily, the vision was clear, and there was no part of me that wanted to call someone for approval. My work, my space, my rules. That was the ending I had built for myself. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that toxic systems don't collapse because you beg them to. They collapse when you stop supporting them, when you stop playing the role they've assigned you. And when they do, you don't owe them your presence at the wreckage. You owe yourself the freedom to keep building something better. That's not just survival, that's winning on your own terms.